Welcome to Telesur. I'm Carla Gonzalez in Quito, and this is from the south. Venezuela has suspended Portuguese airline TAP for 3 months after allowing a relative of opposition member Juan Guaidó to travel with explosives. Juan Marquez, Guaidó's uncle, was arrested upon returning to Venezuela alongside Guaidó last week for allegedly having explosives hidden in various objects in his luggage. The Venezuelan government also accuses TAP of hiding Guaidó's name from the official passenger list and using a false identity for him. Transport Minister Hipólito Abreu said the serious irregularities at TAP could lead to a permanent ban.
We will be evaluating 3 possible levels of action according to what happened. Number 1, a series of fines that correspond to these cases, as well as the possible sanctions or suspensions of the top airline. Depending on the facts that have occurred and how the investigations develop, we could arrive at the revocation of the aeronautical service of this company and permanent suspension.
Aruba's Justice Minister Andine Bicker has denied reports that aviation authorities in that country have intercepted and confiscated a Venezuelan plane carrying 900 kilograms of gold. Bicker said the story carried by media outlets was false. The head of Caribbean Nations Aviation Authority also denied the reports. Protests and candlelight vigils were held in several cities following the announcement of the suspension of the municipal elections in the Dominican Republic on Sunday. Political parties are demanding that all members of the electoral body resign. According to the president of the electoral body, Julio César Castaños, more than half of the electronic devices used in the nationwide election did not work properly. He said the elections will be rescheduled to a later date. Our correspondent, Daisy Toussaint, has more.
The suspension of the municipal elections yesterday marked a historic event in the Dominican Republic. Tensions arose since the moment when the Central Electoral Board suspended the process for the irregularities within the electoral system. Some of the neighborhoods of the country held demonstrations which resulted in the death of 1 person and at least 11 people were injured. The automated vote was implemented in 18 of the 158 municipalities of the country. The manual vote was carried out with normality while the automated system failed to show some of the candidates, all of them from the opposition. This alarmed voters and, of course, the opponent candidates who feared a possible fraud situation and began to call for the suspension of the elections. The Central Electoral Board suspended the process, generating the crisis where things are murky at the moment, and that is why they're asking for an investigation to see if it was a technical mistake or if it was provoked. President Danilo Medina is set to speak tonight to address what's occurring. On Sunday evening, political and social organizations held a vigil in front of the Central Electoral Board asking for the resignation of their members. Former president and leader of the Fuerza del Pueblo party, Leonel Fernandez, said that this was a criminal plot against the Dominican people and it's a tragedy without precedence for the Dominican democracy.
That was Daisy Toussaint from the Dominican Republic. And the candidate for president under Bolivia's movement towards socialism, Luis Arce, has traveled to Argentina to meet with former President Evo Morales. National and departmental leaders of the MAS also traveled for the meeting in Buenos Aires, which will lay out plans for the electoral campaign, as a number of movement leaders remain in exile. A new poll released by private company Unitel shows Arce in the lead nationally and in 5 of 9 departments. Freddy Morales in La Paz has the latest on this election.
Bolivia is awaiting a decision by the Supreme Electoral Court regarding the enabling of Evo Morales as candidate for Senate in the department of Cochabamba. The court announced that this Monday a new list of enabled candidates would be published, which is to include the case of Evo Morales and other candidates of the movement towards socialism, including Luis Arce, the candidate for presidency. Expectations are even higher because the civic committees of Santa Cruz and La Paz, the Union Federation of Chuquisaca, the candidates of the right wing and the hierarchy of the Catholic Church which participated in the November coup, are campaigning and pressuring so that Evo Morales is disqualified from running as candidate. Private media has published the results of a new voter intention survey, which shows MAS candidate Luis Arce in the lead with 31%. Nearly double that of second-place candidate in the poll, Carlos Mesa, with 17%, and which shows Janine Áñez in third place with 16%. That result generated an extreme reactivation of the campaign against the MAS, as well as calls for the unity of far-right-wing candidates to, quote, save the country and democracy.
From La Paz, that was Fede Morales. And also in Bolivia, residents of the city of Sacaba, Cochabamba, marked 3 months since the massacre of November 15th against community members who protested against the coup, which took out President Evo Morales. Families and residents gathered to mark the day when 9 men were killed by the military in one single operation. The residents staged a protest on the main road connecting the city of Cochabamba to the Chapare province. Leaders of the mass party were in attendance, and the victims were remembered as martyrs who were killed in defense of Bolivian democracy. Social organizations in Colombia are calling for a de-escalation of tension between the government of Iván Duque and the largest remaining guerrilla group, the ELN. The call comes after the guerrilla group announced a 3-day armed strike, mainly in the northeast of the country.
The National Liberation Army guerrilla, ELN, has a presence in at least 5 regions of Colombia and a strong influence in the departments of Arauca, Chocó, and the north of Santander, areas in which there have been some acts of war, burning of vehicles and a public transport stoppage after this organization announced a 3-day armed strike.
I think this strike is maybe the most important political act of the ELN in the last decade because it has had a huge impact and dimension. The President and Defense Minister have spoken about it. The people in the cities are worried. The strike that started on Friday morning and is going to go on until Sunday evening. About 30 vehicles have been banned in some regions of the country.
Terminación inmediata de todos los beneficios otorgados a ellos en el pasado por el Estado y la activación de las circulares rojas de la Interpol.
The government of Iván Duque declared the talks with the ELN to be broken after an attack on a police school in the capital in Bogotá in January of 2019, an event that entrenched the position of the executive that has always been against the peace talk.
Indeed, the politics of the government of Duque has no room for peace with the ELN or with other guerrillas movements. It will take political pressure by citizens to make him change his policies, including the inconsistency in applying the terms of the peace agreement with the FARC. But at the same time, President Duque never gave viability to the dialogue agenda that was built by the previous government.
Social organizations are demanding that stakeholders find ways for the restoration of the dialogue between the guerrillas and the government to protect civilians who are the most affected by the conflict.
Estamos soñando.
We are dreaming of seeing the end of the conflict, but we are not seeing it happening because there is a breakdown of dialogue between the government and the National Liberation Army. But we are really concerned by the decision of the armed strike of the ELN. As civil society, we see such as moving further away from the possibility of dialogue, and we are mainly concerned because we don't see political will from the government or the ELN.
At the moment, the ELN peace delegation is in Havana, Cuba, awaiting for direct dialogue with the government, which insists on imposing conditions, a strategy that, according to analysts, is unattainable.
Brazilian truckers have staged demonstrations at Latin America's largest port in Santos, demanding a reduction of ICMS tax on gasoline and diesel. No roadblocks were reported so far, but the protests came after the government sent a bill to Congress aiming to change this tax. ICMS is a tax on sales and services and applies to the movement of goods, transportation, communications, services, and other supplies. The price of diesel is a sensitive issue for truck drivers, whose national strike back in 2018 had a large impact on Brazil's economy. After this break, Canada's PM has to deal with a large indigenous protest against a pipeline project. More details when we come back. Thank you for joining us again. Canada's Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has cancelled his trip to the Caribbean amid protests held by Indigenous people and allies against a planned pipeline project. Trudeau was expected to fly to Barbados on Monday to speak at the two-day meeting of CARICOM heads of government, where he intended to advocate for a seat at the UN Security Council. However, concerns were raised that he would attempt to divide the region amid similar efforts by the US government. Trudeau will be represented by the Foreign Affairs Minister. And Trudeau is facing growing pressure as Indigenous peoples protest the construction of the Coastal GasLink pipeline that will run through Wet'suwet'en territory. Land defenders and other demonstrators shut down one of Canada's busiest rail corridors over the weekend. On Saturday, Indigenous Services Minister Mark Miller met with the Tiendinaga Mohawk First Nation and described the situation as highly volatile. More than 24 people were arrested in early February following similar protests. And we were joined by Montreal-based journalist and editor of Ricochet Media, Ethan Cox, who detailed the persecution of Indigenous peoples at the hands of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police.
The government's big fear in these type of situations is that the First Nations will generate public sympathy. And I think that's certainly what we've seen happening over the last week, with literally hundreds of solidarity demonstrations, actions, blockades of rail lines, this type of thing in response to a raid on all of these sites, on First Nations people. You know, basically what happened is tactical units with the federal police force went in, arrested and removed First Nations people from their own territory. And that has generated a groundswell of opposition in Canada.
And Ethan also hit back at claims that Indigenous peoples were illegally protesting since a court injunction granted construction workers access to their lands.
What we hear a lot from politicians here in Canada is that the rule of law has to be respected. And when they say that, they're talking about an injunction issued by a lower court. But our Supreme Court actually found in a 1997 decision that the Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs are the rightful title holders in that area. And of course, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, which British Columbia adopted into law last year, demands free, prior, and informed consent before putting a resource project like this through, which obviously hasn't happened. So when we talk about the rule of law, it is perhaps more on the side of the Wet'suwet'en than it is on the government. But that's not something we see reflected in media coverage, which often focuses on the injunction.
And finally, Cox said there was a crisis as it relates to press freedom in covering this issue.
We've had something of a crisis of press freedom happening in Canada over the course of these raids. On Thursday, when they raided the first site, journalist Jesse Winter with Vice News and another journalist were detained, removed from the area. There was a huge outcry over that, and as a result, the RCMP said, no, we're going to allow journalists to stay. We're going to allow them to report. Contrary to that, when they arrived at the Gidimkin checkpoint, they detained our journalist, held him for 8 hours, put him in a ditch where he was unable to report properly on what was going on, unable to see everything that was going on, and then didn't allow him to continue on to the Unistoten camp or to move anywhere except to leave. And then we saw a similar sort of thing in the raid on Unistoten on Monday, where several journalists who were embedded there were held in one location by the RCMP. There have been other threats of arrest made against journalists. So we've had a situation where across the board media outlets trying to be there for these raids, trying to cover these nonviolent expressions, have been restricted from doing their job by the RCMP. And that assault on press freedom has been denounced by virtually every major international press freedom group, including the Committee to Protect Journalists, Reporters Without Borders, and Amnesty International.
In other news, United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres has called for de-escalation and diplomacy in the resolution of tensions between India and Pakistan over Kashmir and Jammu after he arrived in Pakistan for a 4-day visit.
Clear that we have taken a position about the need for Security Council resolutions to be implemented and for effective de-escalation and dialogue linked to that, with another very important condition, which is full respect for human rights and continental freedoms in Jammu and Kashmir. In relation to the ceasefire, I visited Unmojib. We believe that Unmojib should have full freedom of movement. It has on the Pakistani side. We hope that this will also be achieved on the other side. And we will be strengthening its equipment capacity in order to better be able to implement its mandate.
Togo's incumbent president Faure Gnassingbé, who is seeking another term in office, has put the fight against terrorism on the top of his campaign agenda. During a Sunday rally, President Gnassingbé has stressed the importance of persevering peace and security, but also to keep up with the fight against religious extremism and terrorism. Togo will hold presidential elections on February 22nd. Coming up, Tunisia could see early elections and a dissolved parliament, so don't go away. Welcome back. Let's continue with news. The Tunisian President Kais Saied has hinted on calling for snap elections if the parliament doesn't approve his government. A few days after key Islamist-inspired Ennahda party pulled out of the government line, proposed by designated Prime Minister Elias Fakfak, President Saied said the only remaining option would be to dissolve parliament and call for an early election. The country went to polls last year. However, a fragmented parliament has stalled so far the efforts to form a new government.
At that time, it is possible, as the Constitution stipulates, to resort to the people since they are sovereign. They grant and withdraw confidence to whomever they wish, and the final word is reserved for the law and for the Tunisians.
Members of the Economic Community of West African States are meeting in Burkina Faso to find a solution to Nigeria's decision to close its borders. In August last year, Nigeria imposed a ban on the movement of goods from neighboring countries, allegedly to curb smuggling. The move was strongly condemned by the community, who says it goes against the principles of the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement. Nigeria has, however, insisted that it will not reopen the borders until its concerns are addressed. Now to China, where the National Health Commission says it has found an effective combination of drugs for the treatment of the COVID-19 virus. The Commission's deputy director told journalists on Monday that doctors found that chloroquine phosphate, an anti-malarial drug, can be effectively used to cure mild cases of the virus. She added that as of Sunday, more than 10,000 patients have been successfully treated and discharged from health facilities. China has been racing to contain the outbreak that has so far killed 1,775 people and infected more than 70,000 people, mostly in mainland China.
Our answer is clear. Although it is a new infection disease, it is controllable and curable. According to the latest data as of Sunday, more than 10,000 were cured and discharged from hospitals. Early diagnosis and early treatment are very effective ways to improve the cure rate. We also analyze our patients' treatment. More than 90% of the patients received antiviral treatment and symptomatic treatment. We enhanced their immunity and provided breathing and circulation support. Such therapies have accelerated patients' recovery. The situation in Wuhan improved a lot. By early diagnosis and treatment and continuous observation of patients with mild symptoms, we can see the proportion of critical cases has dropped from 38% to 18%.
Syrian government forces have made significant advances in their military offensive against the last major rebel stronghold, taking over at least 23 villages west of Aleppo. According to state television, the Russian-backed forces have liberated all the villages and small towns west of Aleppo city. The latest advances come after government forces drove rebel fighters from the key M5 highway, linking Aleppo to the capital, Damascus, and thus reopening the fastest route between Syria's two biggest cities for the first time in years. And on Monday, President Bashar al-Assad congratulated the Syrian Arab Army. He said the victory is a symbol of the Syrian people's will to defend and protect their homeland.
Thus, the battle to liberate the countryside of Aleppo and Idlib continues, regardless of some empty voices coming from the north, as does the battle to liberate all Syrian soil, to crush terrorism and to achieve stability. We all triumphed over the fear that they tried to sow in our hearts. We triumphed over the delusions that they tried to instill in our minds. We triumphed over disintegration, over hatred, over betrayal, and over everyone who represents, carries, and practices these attributes.
Meanwhile, Syria's transport minister has announced the reopening of Aleppo's international airport following the liberation of the city. He has since instructed the relevant authorities to take up all measures required to get the airport operational. The first flight is expected to land on Wednesday morning from Damascus. It will be the first time a civilian aircraft lands at the airport since the war forced its closure in 2012. And President al-Assad also received an Iranian delegation headed by Speaker of Parliament Ali Larijani. During the meeting, al-Assad hailed the strong bilateral ties between the countries, which have helped them defeat Western-sponsored armed groups that have been destabilizing the region. For his part, Larijani affirmed Tehran's continued support to Damascus' efforts to stop the spread of chaos and destabilization pursued by some Western countries and led by the United States. February 17th marks 9 years since former Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi was overthrown and killed by rebels supported by the United States along with their NATO allies. 9 years down the line, the people of Libya are yet to see the freedom and democracy that NATO promised them. The once prosperous nation has plunged into chaos with different militias vying for control of the country. Libya was once at the center of Pan-African unity and has become an open-air slave market, with black Africans being sold for as little as $400. As recent efforts to reach a ceasefire in Libya have failed, a new round of talks is expected to take place soon. But the United Nations fears the recent increase in violence in Libya threatens the possibility of achieving a lasting peace.
There are serious ruptures to this truce. There are serious violations, including additional mobilization and, in fact, as of the last week or 10 days, new strikes in and around Tripoli. And that is, of course, having a direct impact on civilians again.
And with that, we end our news brief, but you can find all of our stories by checking our website, telesurenglish.net. And be sure to also join us on social media. We're on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. For Telesur English, I'm Carla Gonzalez. Thank you for watching.